Welcome to History Nest, where the past whispers you to sleep. Imagine this. You are 14 years old, standing nude in a chilly stone room as unknown women's hands delve into your most intimate areas. Two midwives examine you like animals. At the market, while the Duchess of Bedford looks on with calculating eyes. The February frost that seeps through ruined castles' walls isn't the cause of your shivering. It's out of fear. Your entire future is in these women's grizzled fingers. They only need to say that your seal has been broken and that your life as you know it is over. You're not your typical chick. You are the future queen, blank of Navarre. And the results of this test will decide whether you die in shame or live like a king or queen. If you love learning about the hidden facts of history, think about clicking the like button and subscribing for more content like this before delving into these lost tales of survival and pain. Additionally, kindly let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. It's amazing to me that we're studying these old tales from around the globe together, bound together by our mutual interest in the past and transcending time and location. It was in the year 1453 AD, after being married to Henry Yves Castile for 13 years, Blanche had to undergo a formal examination that verified her virginity. 13 years old, 13 years of sleeping with a man who never made physical contact with her. 13 years of shame masquerading as a royal marriage. Rumors circulated for 13 years about what was wrong with him or her. Strangers would now strip search her at the age of 29 to demonstrate the silent suffering her body had undergone. However, Blanche's tale was not the only one. Every woman who wore or hoped to wear a crown had to face a terrifying reality in the dim hallways of medieval authority. They did not own their bodies. To the very folks who professed to defend them, they were commodities to be examined, and verified. The foundation of medieval Europe was breeding and blood, because it was the most effective way to ensure paternity. Virginity was a highly prized commodity. A woman's shaman became the greatest mark of validity in a time when inheritance was crucial and one heir might decide the fate of entire kingdoms. Bedding a virgin wife was the only surefire way to ensure that a child born out of a marriage would inherit property from his father. The actual testing came in a variety of forms, each more intrusive and degrading than the one before it. Examining theamin was the most evident technique to confirm a woman's virginity. However, superstitious and desperate medieval minds came up with much more complex and barbaric techniques. Think about the sieve test, a process so ridiculous that, if it weren't so harsh, it would be comical. It was customary to test a maiden's virginity by giving her a sieve and seeing if it would contain water in her virginal, pure hands. A soiled maiden was represented by a leaky sieve, which was similar to a leaky bladder. With their reputations on the line, women were made to stand in front of large groups of male onlookers while frantically attempting to stop water from leaking through a kitchen tool's perforations. The urine tests were much stranger. In the same way that modern doctors study blood samples, medieval doctors believe they can identify a woman's virginity by looking at her bodily fluids. Masculium's discretus, according to a document from the 13th century. Virgin's urine is clear and transparent, occasionally white and glittering. Another expert advised watching the procedure because a virgin does, in fact, take longer than a young male to urinate and does so with a faint hiss. Consider the deterioration. Kings' and queens' daughters, noblewomen, were made to urinate in front of male doctors, who said they could detect virtue in the sound of their water hitting a chamber pot. The humiliation was planned, methodical, and accepted as entirely normal. On the occult, some tests were conducted. John of Trevisa, a writer from the 1st century, suggested using a magnet test to determine whether a lady was unfaithful to her husband. When placed beneath the head of a fugitive wife, it would bring her to abruptly embrace her husband. If she was a spouse breaker, she would also abruptly get out of bed due to a terrifying vision. The fumigation experiments, however, were possibly the most horrific. According to Niccolò Fucci, an Italian physician from the 15th century, if a lady is a virgin, she will not be able to detect Theodore through her mouth or nose. If she is covered with a piece of cloth and fumigated with the best coal, doctors observed women's reactions to poisonous vapors, while they were physically smoked like meat. Midwives, who ought to have been sisters in suffering, but instead served as tools of oppression, were frequently the women who conducted these tests. In a display of sisterhood, some midwives pronounced a lady a Virgo intact, when, in fact, she was not. However, the majority of midwives were truthful in their evaluation, and their conclusions helped to cast their fellow women in a negative light. The stifling environment of medieval civilization is the reason why women would betray other women so easily. The thumb of oppression that medieval women lived under was so great, so pervasive, and so embedded in society that the majority of women accepted the cultural discourse that characterized women as evil, dishonest, inferior, and unreliable. Nothing could have raised the stakes more. Social shame was not the only consequence of failing a virginity test. It might be fatal. In certain societies, public execution was the penalty for not proving one's virginity. For others, it meant being cast out to live as a beggar, being banished, or being abandoned. The repercussions for royal ladies were frequently both personal and political. When a queen's virginity was questioned, it may lead to wars, international events, or the breakup of carefully crafted alliances. The experience of Catherine of Aragon serves as an example of how these tests were turned into political weapons. In the 1520s, when Henry VIII attempted to consummate their marriage, Catherine would argue until the end of her life that she had never consummated her first marriage to Henry's brother, Arthur, and that she had arrived in Henry's bed as a virgin. Theologians, lawyers, and politicians who cared nothing for her honor and everything for their political end scrutinized this proud Spanish princess's most private physical sensations for years. In order to demonstrate that their marriage was against divine law, Henry had to demonstrate that Catherine had consummated her union with Arthur. This proved to be more challenging than he had anticipated, because Catherine swore she was a virgin when she first came to Henry. They were questioning and challenging the same body that had been vetted and approved for one royal marriage for another. The actual examination procedure was deliberate torture. Like dissection specimens, royal women would be stripped nude and set out on tables. As midwives or doctors examined their bodies for signs of sexual activity, several witnesses would watch. The ultimate determinant of a woman's value was theamin, that delicate membrane that may be ripped by horseback riding, hard work, or a variety of non-sexual pursuits, while performing the demanding tasks that made up women's labor in the Middle Ages. Some women were born without them, while others prematurely putrid them. But to medieval minds fixated on female purity, these basic facts were meaningless. Any hymen that was missing or torn was automatically taken to be proof of intercourse. Joan of Arc's experience shows how virginity tests went beyond marital politics into issues of divine authority, regardless of the true reason. Under the direction of the Duchess of Bedford, an examination regarding Joan's virginity was carried out at some point before January 13, 1431. Since virgins were thought to be less likely to be recruited by the devil, the first step was to test her virginity. Joan was subjected to the same humiliating physical examination that all significant women had to suffer. Despite the fact that she was facing heresy charges that would result in her execution and months of theological interrogation intended to destroy her spirit, her virginity was investigated more than once. Her virginity was verified by 2 women doing a private examination. A second examination was then carried out by the Duchess of Bedford and her ladies. The irony was heartbreaking. Joan was condemned to lying nude on a table as aristocratic ladies scrutinized her body for proof of her spiritual qualification. Joan claimed to have received visions from God, to have led the French to victory against the English, and to have altered the course of history through her military leadership. Her hymen's condition was far worse than her viella on the battlefield. The importance of these tests was recognized by Joan's prosecutors. Charles's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, then sent Joan on tours to be physically inspected by women who confirmed her virginity. This was done to determine whether she could be the virgin savior of France that was predicted, to demonstrate the sincerity of her devotion, and to make sure she hadn't hung around with the devil. The ramifications for theology were astounding. Christianity in the Middle Ages had established a society in which a woman's spiritual might was solely determined by the state of her genitalia. It seemed like the only way to hear God's voice was through intactamen. Human hands had to physically verify divine revelation. The anguish experienced by the women who made it through these orals went well beyond the examination room. They had to live knowing that their most intimate moments had been snooped on, recorded, and used as proof in religious and political cases. Their bodies, they realized, were never really their own. Fathers, husbands, courts, and religions all claimed ownership of them and the right to inspect them at any time. Some women used deceit to fight back. Stories of shrewd ladies who, when needed, managed to pretend to be virgins abound in medieval literature for a woman in this circumstance. One variation of the trotula offers a few choices. Allow her to carefully place a leech on her labia the day before her wedding. Be careful not to accidentally let it in. After that, blood will flow out here, and a small crust will develop there. The leech technique was really clever and terrifying. In order to provide the appearance of an intactamen during their wedding night examination, women would purposefully injure themselves in their most vulnerable spots, allowing the monsters to suck on their blood. Even though the pain must have been unbearable, it was better than the repercussions of passing a virginity test. Getting a vial of blood wasn't too hard for a shrewd but dirty bride. Animals were frequently butchered for food, and the majority of medieval homes had adjacent farms. Other strategies were just as desperate. Additional strategies included a lady planning a wedding while she was menstruating, or surreptitiously replacing the bride with another woman when it was time to consummate the union. These women were absolutely terrified, as evidenced by the amount of preparation and coordination needed for such deceptions. Some resort to antiquated methods of cosmetic surgery. In order to make women appear virgins, Fetratula implies a vaginal constrictor. Combine the egg whites with water that has been boiled with pennyroyal and spicy herbs 2 or 3 times a day. Insert a fresh linen cloth dipped in it into the vagina. It is devastating to see the desperation these guidelines expose. To avoid the repercussions of failing a virginity test, women were prepared to put potentially harmful drugs into their bodies, cut themselves with leeches, plan complex schemes involving fake brides, and do anything else. The actual wedding night turned into yet another test. However, it was usually lost, which provided the definitive evidence of virginity. A bridegroom only needed blood-stained honeymoon bedding as proof of virginity, as proof of the purity of the wedding night. The bleeding linens were really occasionally stolen from the bed and displayed to others. Serfs would race to check the bed linens for bloodstains the morning after a royal wedding, and occasionally even conveyed to foreign courts as evidence of a successful consummation. A woman's most private moment turned into a spectacle for the public. Her blood and suffering became political currency. The ridapple is the Armenian term for testing for virginity on wedding nights. Some Azerbaijani villages in Georgia include a blood ceremony in their wedding celebrations. These conventions have their origins in medieval European customs and are still followed in some societies today. The underlying instability of these blood ceremonies was their sarcasm. Other than sexual action, hymens are strained and ripped during other physical activities. Even if a woman has never had sex before, she might not bleed during her first sexual experience. However, this biological fact was disregarded in favor of a test that allayed male concerns about female sexuality without offering any concrete proof, because they had a more profound function. Royal doctors and theologians kept using these tests even though they were known to be unreliable. Determining virginity wasn't their main purpose. They have to do with control. They were about making sure that every woman knew that males could always scrutinize, question, and condemn her body, regardless of how powerful she was or how high she was born. There was severe and long-lasting psychological harm. Women who had these exams frequently talked about feeling violated, ashamed, and disconnected from their own bodies. They came to see themselves not as bodies to be inhabited, but as evidence to be controlled. They realized that the state of a tiny piece of tissue, which could be harmed by something as harmless as riding a horse, determined their value as human beings. Catherine of Aragon defended her virginity in European courts for decades. Henry's interpretation of that scriptural scripture meant that their marriage had been incorrect in God's eyes. Even if Catherine had insisted until the end of her life that she had arrived at Henry's bed of virgins, and her marriage to Arthur had not been consummated, she had to endure being questioned about her sexual encounters, reliving her most intimate moments in public testimony, and defending the integrity of her body against political opponents who showed no concern for her suffering. Multiple witnesses. To ensure nothing could be concealed, frigid stone cells with little furniture, and a clinically detached ambience that treated women more like things than like people were all features of the examination rooms that were intended to maximize humiliation. These examinations were performed by women who had been educated to be thorough, intrusive, and dispassionate. Hours were spent on some exams. In shifts, several doctors or midwives would double-check their findings. Strangers used cold devices to explore the bodies of women in disgusting stances with their legs spread wide. Throughout the process, they were not allowed to express their feelings, complain, or speak. The examination itself was frequently worse than the aftermath. Failure to pass a virginity test might lead to life in jail, exile, or instant execution. There was no assurance of safety even after successful testing. Although Blanche of Navarre's successful virginity test in 1453 AD should have been a triumph, Blanche was then taken back to Navarre at the expense of her youth, her dignity, and her aspirations for a typical marriage. She had demonstrated her virginity. Her tale highlights the precarious circumstances that medieval royal women found themselves in. They were punished and humiliated if they failed virginity exams. They were frequently thrown away even if they passed. The very tests that were meant to preserve their honor have depleted their worth as political porn. These inspections were meticulously and dehumanizingly documented. In court documents, women's bodies are described in clinical detail, including the state of the menstrual system, the look of the genitalia, and the women's responses. The embarrassment of a single investigation would reverberate across history because these records were kept for decades, if not centuries. The trial records of Joan of Arc provide in-depth descriptions of her virginity tests conducted by men who did not see any conflict between presenting her body as evidence in court and honoring her as a divine messenger. Rumor must have told her judges that the three Joneses, his aunt, wife, and daughter, approved of Jean de Luxembourg in Beaurevoir, his castle, where he sold her to the English. They pleaded with him not to sell her. However, even many who respected her bravery thought it was acceptable to look at her nude body. These exams' religious underpinnings were especially perverse. Christianity in the Middle Ages taught that the body was the Holy Spirit's temple. However, it also viewed women's bodies as crime scenes that needed to be looked at for the sake of moral purity. The same religion that taught about the sanctity of human dignity often infringed upon that dignity. Joan clarified her previous response by saying that she believed she would be saved if she had maintained her word to art, that if her hymen was broken, her discussions with saints and angels would be in vain. The tests also demonstrated medieval society's extreme medical ignorance. Doctors who professed to be experts in assessing virginity frequently lacked knowledge of female anatomy. They mistook signs of sexual behavior for normal variances in histile tissue. Normal bodily processes were viewed by them as indicators of moral decay. Aside from the actual pain they caused, several tests were so ridiculous they bordered on comedy. The notion that virgins had distinct urine sparkles, that they could keep water in reserves, and that they responded differently to magnetic fields. If these ideas hadn't destroyed so many lives, they would be absurd. Nevertheless, women managed to oppose and undermine these structures. Women might cheat the PSI-V test by simply applying lanolin on the inside of the PSI-V. According to anecdotal evidence, they gave advice on how to strengthen vaginal muscles, create false bloodstains, and schedule their menstrual cycles to align. with exams. It took exceptional bravery to carry out these acts of resistance. The penalties for women who were detected cheating on virginity tests were much harsher than those for those who failed. They were charged with fraud, deceit, and tampering with the natural order. Nevertheless, they kept supporting one another, establishing unofficial networks of information and assistance that were not accessible through conventional channels. These tests had enormous economic ramifications. Trade agreements worth fortunes, territorial trades, and enormous stories were all part of royal marriages. Contracts worth more than most individuals would see in several lifetimes may be void if the virginity test was failed. International commerce was founded on women's hymens. Henry was around 18 and Catherine was around 23 when they were married. Henry's father was unimaginably wealthy thanks to Catherine's massive dowry from Spain, which included trade advantages and territorial claims. Catherine's virginity turned into a legal and economic conflict that affected courts throughout Europe when Henry later attempted to annul their marriage. Additionally, the tests were used as political tools. Claims of lost virginity could eliminate handy wives, undermine rival throne claims, or provide an excuse for violent military operations. Concerns about their virginity that had never bothered them throughout years of marriage might suddenly surface for kings who wished to divorce their wives. Virginity tests became instruments of international politics, as evidenced by Henry VIII's campaign against Catherine of Aragon. After acknowledging the testimony, Henry claimed to have discovered Catherine to be a virgin. However, he then asserted that because she had previously been married to his brother, their union was null and void. The inconsistency shows how these tests were applied selectively when it was convenient and disregarded when it conflicted with political objectives. The psychological campaign was planned and methodical. The fear of testing was often more potent than the actual examination, as kings and nobles realized. The risk of unexpected, intrusive examination influenced the behavior of women who lived in continual anxiety of being tested. Noble women developed a paranoid culture as a result of this anxiety. They kept a close eye on their own bodies, looking for symptoms that could be misread when being examined. Even when those activities were essential for their enjoyment or well-being, they stayed away from anything that could harm their hymens. They were incarcerated within their own bodies. It had a significant and long-lasting effect on medieval marriage practices. Instead of being intimate gatherings, wedding nights, tornado shows, couples went into their first sexual experience, knowing that the next morning, any proof of the woman's virginity would be scrutinized and evaluated. Both spouses were left damaged by the terrible experiences that frequently followed the urge to generate blood. In order to guarantee successful exams, some couples created complex rituals to ensure bleeding. They would prepare animal blood to put on linens, or have the lady cut just enough during sexual activity. What ought to have been intimate moments were transformed into deliberate lies by these preparations. Complicit in systematic abuse were the court officials and slaves who took part in these rites. They were aware of the suffering and embarrassment they were causing. But since losing their jobs or getting punished themselves was the alternative, they kept taking part. Under the guise of higher aims, the system produced networks of individuals who continued to harm others. Women's most intimate moments were turned into public spectacles in royal courts, which devolved into theaters of degradation. Courtiers would congregate to observe examinations, offer commentary on the findings, and disseminate rumors about their observations. The humiliation was intended to be long-lasting and public. The anguish of these exams will be felt for generations to come because of their cord-keeping procedures. Every aspect of women's bodies, their responses to examinations, and the conclusions of their examiners were documented by court scribes. For decades, or perhaps centuries, these documents could be consulted since they were kept in royal archives. For years following her passing, Catherine of Aragon's examination records were referenced in court cases long after it had any practical significance. The condition of her high hymen was still a topic of discussion among academics and theologians. Instead of being a human experience to be revered, her body was reduced to a historical artifact to be examined. Failure of the tests has far-reaching consequences on a global scale. Intimate examinations may lead to the cancellation of trade deals, the dissolution of military alliances, the declaration of wars, and diplomatic crises involving several nations if a queen's virginity was questioned. International instability resulted from political marriages failing because of virginity issues. The carefully crafted accords of nations that had made investments in royalties were deemed useless. Millions of lives lost and vast sums of money were the political and economic toll of failed testing. To assure accuracy, some kingdoms created regulations mandating several examinations by various midwifery teams. These laws, which purported to guard against fraud, actually made the exploitation more widespread. Women's bodies were viewed as state resources to be controlled by the bureaucracies of violation they established. The systematic nature of this misuse is demonstrated by the training provided to examination staff. Physicians and midwives were given detailed instructions on how to do virginity tests, what to look for, and how to record the results. They were instructed to get over their innate reluctance to infringe on women's privacy in order to further more significant political objectives. Professional classes of persons whose careers hinged on their readiness to study women's bodies were produced by these training programs. They became proficient in methods that were highly significant politically, but had no medical significance. Claiming to have moral and physical benefits, they turned into specialized tools of tyranny. Medieval women were incredibly intelligent and resilient, as evidenced by the resistance tactics they devised. They established unofficial networks to exchange knowledge about surviving exams. They created physical deception methods that an in-depth understanding of chemistry and anatomy. Some women developed a skill for timing exams to align with organic processes that could obscure signs of sexual activity. In order to prevent supplying more proof of their alleged guilt, they learnt to regulate their emotional responses during examinations. They developed extraordinary self-control and meticulous training to become performers who could withstand humiliating scrutiny. It was impossible for the religious ladies who performed some examinations to reconcile their given responsibilities with their spiritual convictions, because nuns and other religious leaders were believed to be more trustworthy assessors of female purity due to their own chaste vows. They were frequently selected to inspect royal women. These religious examiners had to make a compromise between their involvement in systematic violations and their views on spiritual worth and human dignity. Those who refused to take part were disciplined for their opposition. Others compartmentalized their behavior, viewing exams as religious obligations rather than interpersonal relationships. The technological investment in these procedures is demonstrated by the creation of medical devices designed especially for virginity testing. Experts developed instruments to more correctly measure tissue, more accurately probe women's bodies, and more accurately record their findings. These devices were created with the same attention to detail and care as other medical devices. However, they had no valid medicinal use. They were instruments of oppression, masquerading as scientific instruments, weapons masquerading as tools of knowledge. These activities were encouraged by widespread and substantial financial incentives. Physicians and midwives who performed examinations were paid generously for their work. Test-arranging court officials were rewarded with bonuses and prospects for promotion. The entire structure made it profitable to engage in systemic abuse. Even once people became aware of the negative consequences of virginity testing, these financial incentives made sure that it would continue. The practice was profitable for too many people to let ethical considerations get in the way of successful operations. The extent to which these tests permeated medieval culture is demonstrated by their literary and artistic depictions. Virginity tests were commonly portrayed in paintings, tapestries, and literature as common and essential aspects of aristocratic life. The personification of virginity is shown in Caesar Reaper's 1611 woodcut picture, in which she fights off Cupid with one hand while holding a sieve in the other. Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, is depicted holding a sieve in the well-known painting from 1579. The symbols and concepts that had legitimized the systematic abuse of women's bodies were nevertheless celebrated in art even centuries after the worst practices had stopped. Virginity testing supporting legal systems established precedents that have shaped law for centuries. Courts established intricate protocols for carrying out investigations, assessing the evidence, and imposing penalties under the guise of justice. These legal frameworks institutionalized abuse for legal and ethical reasons. Legal scholars established academic disciplines based on the violation of women's bodies and wrote lengthy commentaries on the proper conduct of virginity tests, the validity of various examination techniques, and the proper responses to various findings. Advanced and inhumane psychological methods were employed to get ladies ready for tests. Court officials devised strategies to dismantle women's opposition, get them to assist in their own violation, and stop them from objecting to their treatment. Isolation, threats, prizes for collaboration, and well-planned demonstrations of the negative effects of resistance were some of these psychological preparation strategies. Their purpose was to depress ladies before the physical examination started. The post-examination procedures were similarly methodical and inhumane. In order to deal with the political fallout from failed marriages, penalize women who failed tests, and get rid of women who were no longer valuable political assets, courts created intricate processes. These procedures included the possibility of forced religious conversion, imprisonment, exile, and execution. They viewed women as expendable resources who should be punished to any extent for not upholding purity standards. These practices were so common and well coordinated that they were supported by worldwide networks. Courts around Europe coordinated their responses to failed examinations, exchanged information about examination methods, and compared test outcomes. These networks made it impossible for women to flee persecution by relocating abroad or requesting refuge from other leaders. The system's global reach and shared goal resulted in a web of tyranny that imprisoned women regardless of their position or geography. The cold, mechanical nature of these determinations is exposed by the economic calculations that were used to determine when examinations were required. Court officials created algorithms to determine when the risks and expenses of tests were offset by the political advantages of testing. Instead of treating women's pain as a moral issue to be avoided, these calculations viewed it as a cost to be controlled. Human dignity was diminished to the level of political ledger entries. The technological advancements that enhanced examination methods demonstrate the amount of mental effort put into refining these infractions. New tools for more comprehensive examinations, new recording systems for evidence preservation, and new techniques for identifying signs of sexual activity were all created by medical researchers. The same commitment and ingenuity that went into making positive medical advancements were used to seek these discoveries. They stand for a significant investment of human intelligence in support of institutionalized tyranny. The examining staff's training materials demonstrate how bureaucratic these procedures are. Comprehensive guides outlined correct examination techniques, typical blunders to avoid, and suitable reactions to various results. Instead of treating the abuse of women's bodies as a moral offense to be avoided, these manuals viewed it as a technical talent to be acquired. Presenting abuse as a valid medical procedure, they established professional norms for its execution. Exams frequently had psychological effects that were worse than the actual physical violation. Women who were tested reported long-lasting trauma that impacted their relationships, sense of self, and capacity for trust. The sensation of being reduced to objects for scrutiny was one from which many women never fully recovered. They experienced intimacy issues, self-harming behaviors, and ongoing fear of having their bodies examined again. Resistance to these behaviors was infrequent and ineffectual due to their cultural normalization. Women were indoctrinated by society that tests were required and justified, that political stability was more essential than their discomfort, and that it was harmful and self-serving to oppose testing. Due to the effectiveness of this cultural programming, many women voluntarily engaged in their own violations, thinking they were carrying out significant social duties and higher goals. Medieval virginity testing has left a legacy that goes well beyond the actual Middle Ages. For centuries afterward, civilization's treatment of women's bodies has been influenced by the beliefs and attitudes that supported these practices. Medieval European customs are the direct ancestors of modern virginity testing techniques in many societies worldwide. The regions of Asia, the Middle East, and Northern and Southern Africa are where virginity testing is most prevalent. Although the methods have changed, the underlying premise that women's bodies should be inspected and managed by outsiders has not. Medieval examination methods are the origin of the medical profession's long-standing practice of using women's reproductive systems as objects for malcontrol and research. In medical education and practice, the notion that women's bodies are suitable subjects for male authority to investigate grew ingrained. Medieval court practices are the direct ancestors of the legal systems that, in certain jurisdictions, still permit virginity testing today. In the U.S., virginity tests are permitted by law for medical professionals. The institutional frameworks that historically facilitated the methodical analysis of royal women are still in place, albeit in different configurations. The psychological processes described in medieval literature are exactly the same as those exhibited by victims of virginity testing today. The pain, the embarrassment, the detachment from their own bodies, and the challenge of developing close relationships. Medieval observers were aware of all these impacts, but the customs persisted. Medieval women established similar patterns of resistance to virginity testing in modern times. Medieval women devised various strategies to defend themselves and others, and modern activists utilize many of the same arguments, encounter many of the same challenges, and use many of the same techniques. Virginity testing has been condemned by the international human rights movement, which is a rejection of the beliefs and customs that have dominated European society for centuries. The World Health Organization, UN Women, and the UN Human Rights Council demanded in October 2018 that virginity testing be outlawed, since it is a stressful, painful, and degrading practice that is considered assault against women. However, in many nations, law, health, and social policy are still influenced by the belief that women's sexual purity is a public issue rather than a personal one. The tales of women such as Joan of Arc, Catherine of Aragon, serve as a reminder that the abuse of women's bodies for the sake of political and religious power has a long history and fatal repercussions. Medieval governmental structures were not the cause of their suffering. It was essential to the way societies controlled female sexuality and the way power functioned. Their examiners could never match the bravery, intelligence, and dignity with which these women approached their orals. They suffered atrocities that would shatter many contemporary people. Nevertheless, they persisted in defending their humanity, rights, and reputations. Their resistance caused seemingly indestructible fissures in oppressive institutions. Other women were motivated to challenge authorities and demand better treatment by their reluctance to tolerate degrading treatment without complaint. Later, generations of women who battled to regain control over their own bodies used their experiences as rallying points. These women endured in examination rooms that have long since been reduced to dust. History has forgotten the men who ordered their abuse. However, the bravery these ladies showed during their most difficult times still serves as motivation for those who oppose injustice today. Every woman who has ever been reduced to an object for male scrutiny was symbolized by Blanche of nude figure, quivering in that chilly stone cell. In 1453 AD, her society accepted her persistent, lawful degradation as usual. Her survival, however, was an act of defiance against those who wished to eradicate her humanity. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to subscribe to History Nest, where every night a new story takes flight.